Okay, take a look up on the board and you can see 3 examples of the types of problem we're going to ask you to take to solve in your first lesson. Lesson 1.1, we need to rewrite rational numbers as decimals, take decimals and write them as fractions or rational numbers, and then we also need to find some square roots like in example 3. So let's start with example 1 here. Remember we talked about last week to write a fraction as a decimal, divide the numerator by the denominator. 1 divided by 5. Remember that's what that fraction bar means, division. So we can just do the long division here. 1 divided by 5. 5 doesn't go into 1. Put down your decimal. Bring down a 0, write a 0. 5 goes into 10. 2 times. So 1/5 becomes 0.2. That is how you write a fraction as a decimal. We showed you that on another video too. Sometimes, like in this example here, you'll end up with a repeating decimal. Take a look. 1 divided by 3. 1 divided by 3. One more time. 3 does not go evenly into 1. So we write down the 0, our decimal point, add a 0. 3 goes into 10 3 times. 3 times 3 is 9. And we're going to have a remainder of 1, bring down another 0, and you can see how this is going to work. That's going to keep repeating. So we would end up with 1/3 as a decimal equivalent of 0.3 repeating. Okay. So there's writing fractions as decimals. Divide the numerator by the denominator. Top number divided by the bottom number. And you will either divide until you get 0 as a remainder and the decimal stops, or until your decimal repeats. Next thing I'll ask you to do is take decimals and write them as fractions. To do this, the easiest way to do it is to say the number without using the word point. In other words, 0.7 is another way of saying 7/10. And 7/10 sounds a lot like a fraction. 7/10. And it is. Let's come down to this guy here. 0.35 would be, that's the tenths column, that's the hundredths. So it's 35 hundredths would be your fraction, 35 over 100, and we should simplify that. 5 goes into 35 and 100, 5 goes into 35 7 times, and 5 goes into 100 20 times. So we should simplify that one to 7/20, and we'll leave this guy as 7/10. Alright, now what happens when we have a repeating decimal? Now in your textbook, they go through great lengths to explain the why behind what I'm going to show you. But for today, what I want you to understand is when you have a repeating decimal, to rewrite it as a fraction, the easiest thing to do is write it as though it was not repeating. For instance, if this was not repeating, it would be 7/10. And you subtract 1 from the denominator. So 0.7 repeating, instead of being 7/10, we subtract 1 from the denominator, and it becomes 7/9. 7/9. And if you check that with a calculator, 7 divided by 9, it's going to give you 0.7 repeating. And this works for any number, any repeating decimal. 0.35 repeating, well remember 0.35 we said was 35 100ths. When we have a repeating decimal, we subtract 1 from the denominator, and we make it 35 over 99. And sure enough, you can check that one. 35 divided by 99 will give you 0.353535. Repeating decimals. The why behind this is kind of a rather lengthy process. You can see it in your textbook, but again, I don't want you to worry too much about it right now. Last thing we're going to have to do today is find square roots. Now remember, any positive number has two square roots, a positive one and a negative one. Square root, definition of a square root is a number multiplied by itself. So here we go. We have x squared equals 121. To find out what x would be, we would find the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared is x. And the square root of 121, which two numbers multiplied together, same number, would give you 121, would be 11. 11 times 11 is 121. But also remember that negative 11 times negative 11 is also 121. So either positive 11 or negative 11 would satisfy this equation. Same thing when you have a fraction. Any fraction we give you at this point, both your numerator and your denominator, you'll notice will be perfect squares. 16 is a perfect square, its square root is 4. 25 is a perfect square, its square root is 5. So we can say when we find the square root of x squared, that would just be x, and the square root of 16/25. The square root of 16 is 4, square root of 25, 5, and remember that could be positive or negative. Positive 4/5 times positive 4/5 is 16/25, and negative 4/5 times negative 4/5 would also be the 16/25. All right, so there's a couple examples of the types of problems you're going to have to do for this week's homework. Good luck.